In this video, we'll look at the actual outbreak of war in April 1861. Lincoln had hoped after his election before his inaugural that tensions would cool, but unfortunately the question of federal property in the South was coming to a boil. The Confederates were threatening to take this federal property, and Lincoln had to react. Well, one of the most prominent of the federal properties was the federal Fort Sumter on an island in the middle of Charleston, South Carolina's harbor, protecting the harbor. You can see it in this video. I mean, Fort Sumter was an obvious irritant, a federal garrison, a fortress right in the middle of the hotbed of rebellion. Aware of this, the North had put Major Robert Anderson, a Kentuckian, as commander, hoping that he would be less provocative than his Massachusetts predecessor. As the Confederacy declared its intention to claim all federal property within their states, Anderson, of course, worried about his position. The fort was on an island, as I said, but it was actually abandoned, and the federal garrison was on the mainland. Thinking an attack was imminent, Anderson got permission to have the garrison retreat to the abandoned island fort. Now, as it turned out, this move really sort of appeared provocative to the Southerners nearby. Indeed, Anderson had spiked a number of the guns on the mainland before he retreated. South Carolina sent representatives to Washington to negotiate a transfer of the fort to South Carolina, but of course the federal government wasn't going to consider it. Fort Sumter wasn't the only federal garrison that was being pressured. Another prominent fort was in Pensacola, Florida, Fort Pickens, and you can see it in its map here. And it was demanded by the Confederacy to be returned to as well. But Fort Sumter was where the Civil War is actually going to begin, but it wasn't the only fort. Of course, in the press, all this was playing big, and in the North, the press had begun to play up Anderson as kind of a hero. The Northern sentiment was strongly against simply surrendering the fort. The federal government tried to send in reinforcements and supplies to Anderson, but the Confederates had put General Pierre Beauregard in command in the nearby areas around Charleston, and he ordered the ships shelled. The ships quickly have retreated out to the sea. Soon after taking office, Lincoln received word from Anderson that if the fort did not get supplies soon, it would have to surrender. It would fall. Secretary of State William Seward had an idea. He argued that Lincoln should temporarily abandon the fort, just as Lincoln had suggested as a possibility in his inaugural, to buy more time and to keep from angering the Upper South. Seward kind of saw himself as, better than Lincoln, better than the backwoods Lincoln. He was still kind of annoyed by his loss in the Republican nomination. But he ended up leaking word of his proposal to the press, hoping to put some pressure on Lincoln. Lincoln, not surprisingly, saw Seward's actions as insubordinate, and also the Republican masses seemed to react to the leak and proposal with anger. Lincoln therefore decided to resupply the fort by running reinforcement and supplies in at night, with the fort and nearby warships ready to respond with gunfire if it was necessary. At the same time, by the way, he authorized another reinforcement of Fort Pickens in Florida. When word leaked out that Lincoln had rejected Seward's proposal to withdraw, Seward felt that he had to, come up with an alternative to save face and avoid war. Spain and France had become more active in the Caribbean, and Seward proposed, at least in so many words, to declare that their actions were a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. The news reports, and hey, maybe even the war in Spain and France that might follow, would unite the country in a frenzy of nationalism. If nothing else, the controversy would buy them time with the South. Again, not surprisingly, Lincoln quickly rejected the far-fetched scheme. As an aside, I should note some historians have said Lincoln was a political genius to put his political rivals in his cabinet, people like William Seward. You keep your enemies close type of idea. As a matter of fact, that was one of the theses of the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals, if you're familiar with that. Won a bunch of awards. Anyway, Lincoln did agree to meet with a group of Virginians just as all his information about Fort Sumter hit the news, but little came of that meeting, however. Lincoln decided to make one last attempt to prevent fighting as he ordered the fort resupplied. What he decided to do was send in supply ships, unarmed, while warships waited in the harbor. And he would even tell Beauregard and the Confederates that the unarmed ship was coming and was absolutely no threat to them. If the Confederates still shelled the ship, then the fort would respond and warships would shell the attackers as well. Here you can see a picture of William Seward and some of his correspondence with Lincoln. The problem was that all the media reports and leaks had made Fort Sumter a symbol to both the North and the South. Southerners saw it as a matter of pride, and so did Northerners. On April 9, 1861, the Confederate cabinet ordered General Beauregard to demand the surrender of the fort before the U.S. fleet arrived. If they refused, they said, shell it. Anderson rejected the demands for surrender and asked Beauregard just to leave him alone, since his garrison would soon run out of supplies and have to leave anyway. Beauregard asked him how long he needed, and Anderson said to April 15th. Beauregard said that was unacceptable because he thought Anderson was stalling and the fleet would arrive by then. So at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, the Confederate guns opened fire. The U.S.'s response and defense was kind of futile. Anderson's troops were outgunned 4-1. Moreover, the U.S.'s best warships were mistakenly dispatched to Fort Pickens, and the high seas prevented the arrival of others. After 33 hours of shelling, Anderson surrendered. Although oddly, not a man on either side was killed by any of the firing. That's good. Here you can see a picture of the fort after the surrender, and you note the Confederate flag that's flying there. And on April 14th, 2 days later, the Confederate States of America assumed command of Fort Pickens, and all of this is generally considered the beginning of the Civil War, of course. Today, Fort Pickens and Fort Sumter are national landmarks, and you can see a picture of Fort Sumter here today. The day after Fort Sumter's surrender, Lincoln called for the states to raise 75,000 militia, an action that angered much of the Upper South, as we'll see. The North came together in a sort of a war fever. Douglas and his Northern Democrats promised their full support. The abolitionists, again, some of whom had been, like William Lloyd Garrison had said, good riddance to the South, now responded favorably to the call to arms. All the Northern governors promised militia, although only Massachusetts had militia really prepared for a quick fight, and you can see some of the Massachusetts militia here. Patriotic telegrams arrived. People cheered in rallies. Nobody thought the war would last long. Nobody really fully appreciated what a modern all-out industrial war on our own soil would entail, how bad it would be. Here you see a flyer, on to Richmond, yeah, it's going to be great type of idea. As I've said, war fever also swept the South, and all the governors in the Upper South states refused to issue militia to Lincoln. And the call led immediately in these states to secession conventions voting to join the Confederacy. These states saw the call as a sort of a coercion they believed the North had promised not to do. By the end of May, all of the Upper South had seceded, most notably Virginia, and you can see the Virginia Ordinance of Secession here, but also Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina. Virginia and these other states were hugely important. They collectively held over 1/2 of the manufacturing capacity that the entire Confederacy would have. They ended up supplying 40% of the Confederate forces. As the Upper South seceded, their militias there quickly moved to take advantage of the federal facilities. They easily took Harper's Ferry Arsenal outside Washington, we mentioned earlier, and more importantly, they took the shipbuilding port of the Norfolk and Hampton Roads, Virginia. This was the largest shipbuilding facilities in the South, and you can see it's depicted here in a map of it. Virginia had a number of counties in its northwest where the mountains had prevented the large plantation economy from taking full root. The poor settlers there had long fought the state government, which had, of course, been dominated by the plantation elite. Upon Virginia's secession, these counties held their own conventions and in time voted to secede from Virginia. They were ultimately admitted to the United States as a new state of West Virginia in 1863. And you can see the arrow here pointing to these counties in what had been Virginia and what is today is the state of West Virginia. Of course, when the Upper South joined and Fort Pickens fell and Hampton Roads fell, the ease with which these facilities fell just sort of emboldened the Confederacy. When the Upper South seceded, the Confederate States had grown to 11 states, and you can see it depicted here. Now, the Confederacy did not hold all the slave states. There were a number of slave states, the border states, that still allowed slavery that had not joined. And, those states are going to be really divided. Delaware had some Southern sympathizers, but that one remained safely Unionist. Maryland, sadly, was evenly split. Pro-slavery militia had already begun to muster. The state governor, however, was a Unionist and placed the state under martial law to keep order. He suspended habeas corpus, and I'll talk more about that later on, but it means the body of law. Essentially, it means due process. Of course, in both states, slave owners were allowed to keep their slaves. There were no attempts to free slaves in these border states. If there had been, the North feared that those border states would join the Confederacy too. Kentucky was pretty much evenly split, and the unfortunate result was an awful lot of bloodshed. Nowhere else was the term Brothers' War more appropriate. Here you can see a picture of two brothers who actually fought on different sides. It wasn't just in Kentucky, but it was more prominent in these border states. By the way, one of Senator Critten's sons, I mentioned the Crittenden Compromise earlier, one became a general for the U.S. and one became a general for the Confederacy. Of Henry Clay's grandsons, 3 fought for the United States and 4 for the Confederacy. Kentucky was, of course, strategically important. Its river and road network was important to the war out west. Lincoln reportedly commented, quote, "I hope to have God on my side, but I gotta have Kentucky." At first, Kentucky tried to stay neutral. Its governor refused militia calls from both sides. Its legislature passed a neutrality proclamation. Both sides at first tried to respect Kentucky's neutrality, worrying that moving to gain control would anger the people and force them into the other side. Finally, in late 1861, when a Union army was nearby, the Confederates occupied parts of Kentucky, and indeed that angered the people. The governor and legislature voted to stay in the Union. But a group of Kentucky secessionists still held a convention and declared Kentucky part of the Confederacy. In the end, as I say, there was clearly a lot of fighting went on in Kentucky between Kentuckians. It was really unfortunate. Missouri, another western border state, might even have been worse. Here the governor was a secessionist and began to organize a Missouri militia for the Confederacy. The Union Army, however, organized its own Union militia at the same time. They fought throughout the war, not just in 1861. Leading the Union troops for a while was John C. Fremont, the Republican presidential candidate from California. The armies not only fought, but mobs roamed, and guerrilla warfare among the population was almost constant. In the end, Missouri officially declared for the Union, but like Kentucky, secessionists declared that they represented Missouri, and they continued to fight. It was all just very nasty and bloody. Right after the Mexican-American War, the United States Army really wasn't that powerful. It demobilized, and I'll talk more about preparations for the Civil War in a bit. But it didn't have that many experienced and able generals. One of the most notable was Robert E. Lee from Virginia. Lee was the son of Light Horse Harry Lee, who had been a Revolutionary War hero. Light Horse Harry Lee had kind of squandered the money of his family, but Lee had married a wealthy woman and inherited an estate with slaves. He had spent his entire life in the military, and he didn't really, he didn't like slavery, but he depended on it with his plantation, and he didn't really like secession, but he felt he could not fight against his own country, which he saw as Virginia. Lee was offered the command of the entire United States Army, but he thought about it, but he decided that he could not turn against what he called his own country. He saw Virginia as his country. and he offered his services to Virginia instead. He then had to leave his plantation at Arlington, just across the Potomac River from Washington. Union troops arrived, and you can see them here standing outside after Lee's departure. And they later decided to make the plantation a national cemetery to bury Union troops on Lee's property, kind of in your face. And today, of course, the Arlington National Cemetery is a national treasure. After returning to Virginia, Lee took command of the state militia in the rebellious western counties, but his forces actually performed poorly there. Lee was ridiculed as Granny Lee, his gray beard. He looked old and out of it. Nevertheless, he was soon offered command of the Army of Northern Virginia, and in time would demonstrate his military genius and would become one of the famous generals of the war. Interestingly, here, when he was out in West Virginia, he got his horse, which he called Traveler. You can see a picture of it here. It was and he rode it throughout the war, and you can see an historical marker in that regard. But we'll obviously talk a lot more about Robert E. Lee in the discussion of the Civil War later. So to recap, the slave border states remained in the Union. You can see them here in light blue Union, either by choice or force. Maryland and Delaware were in control of the Union. Missouri, Kentucky, and West Virginia were all in the Union, but a lot of ongoing internal and external conflict in those states, as I've said. This concludes the video on the actual war beginning and, around the period of April 1861.